It is impossible to imagine a world without flowers. The most arid of urban landscapes, the driest of deserts, the most frozen of Arctic tundra is brightened with some kind of blossom at some point during the year. These words were written by noted Quilt magazine editor Mary Johnson in the opening lines of her 1984 text, A Garden of Quilts. She goes on to say that flowers have been the inspiration for artists since the cave painters. Indeed, flowers do have a central place in the arts. Poetry abounds with references to flowers. William Shakespeare writes about nodding violets, luscious woodbine, sweet musk roses, hot lavender, and pale primrose, as well as pansies, lilies, and poppies, just to name a few. Painters have made flowers the subject of their artwork for centuries. Take, for instance, Impressionist Claude Monet, Post-Impressionist Vincent van Gogh, American modernist Georgia O'Keeffe, and any of the Dutch Old Masters. Flowers even inspired the Art Nouveau movement, Elizabethan tapestries, and Victorian designs. I could go on, but we would be here all afternoon. Quilters are motivated by the same influences as poets, painters, and other artists. They pull from popular fashions, art movements, popular culture, and literally from the world outside their doors. So it is not surprising that quilters, like poets and painters, have adorned their creations with flowers for centuries. But like all artistic designs, the use of flowers and their appearance and execution change over time as new styles come and go and tastes transition from one style to the next. Floral pattern and floral fabric quilts in the Ohio History Connections permanent collection are numerous. Of our nearly 500 quilts, more than 150 either feature floral designs or are constructed from fabrics with floral patterns. When these quilts are examined as a group, patterns start to emerge. We can see particular designs and fabrics rise and fall from popularity, and we see methods of construction change. These dynamics in American quilt design were influenced in the early years of Ohio's statehood by economics and trade, when Ohioans had access to only imported or homespun fabric. German immigration to Ohio after 1830 introduced new designs in colors popular in American decor at the time. Quilters later adopted Japanese design elements following the debut of that nation's art at the Centennial International Exposition in 1876. The First and Second World Wars sparked a longing for a quote-unquote simpler past before modern warfare that renewed interest in quilting, and older quilt patterns vaulted to popularity once again. Companies made quilt patterns and later kits available for busy modern women to participate in the handwork movement, while new designs made quilting accessible to women in the mid-1900s who had little experience in handwork techniques. Today, quilters create original designs that have helped to elevate quilts to works of art, at a time when consumers are opting for unique handmade goods as an alternative to mass-produced items from big box stores. Before I continue, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about quilt construction for the non-quilters or novice quilters in attendance today. The floral pattern quilts in the Ohio History Connections collection are commonly constructed using the applique method. To produce these quilts, the quilter cut shapes out of fabrics in any design he or she could imagine, though likely she, and she applied them to blocks of usually white fabric. So on the screen here is an example. It's a folk art style applique that the quilter made out of plaid fabric. She pinned it to the blue ground and then basted it. That's the white stitching down the middle. And the basting stitches hold it in place, and then she'll then secure it using usually a blind stitch, sometimes a buttonhole stitch, and then she'll remove the pins and the basting. And that's just for one block. After completing each block, the quilter then stitches the blocks together to form horizontal or diagonal rows, and then sews the rows together to make a quilt top. The applique designs are entirely ornamental, and quilters often flaunted their skilled handwork, those tiny, perfectly even stitches, as well as their own artistic designs. While flowers are most popular as a design motif for applique quilts, other methods for producing floral pattern quilts are evident in our collection as well. Wholecloth quilts, popular among American quilters in the 17 and early 1800s, have tops made from either a single piece of fabric or two lengths of fabric sewn together down the long edges. Since fabric could only be as wide as the loom on which it was woven, 2 pieces were often needed to make a quilt of appropriate width to fit a bed. Wholecloth quilts can have 2 different floral elements in their designs. Some employ fabric printed with floral designs that can be purchased in a wide array of colors. Others were made of solid color fabric and quilted with floral designs. The example up here on the screen is a modern example. It's a small wholecloth quilt where the quilter has made a flower design out of her quilting stitches on the single piece of fabric that makes up the quilt top. And you can also see just a little bit of the backing in that left-hand picture. That is also a floral print fabric on the backing, so she managed to bring in flowers in 2 different ways in this quilt. Quilters have also created floral designs in what are called pieced quilts. These quilts are made of small geometric pieces stitched together to create larger blocks. While some piece quilt tops are assembled in abstract designs, sometimes a quilter arranges the pieces to create a larger pattern, such as pinwheels, stars, or in this case, flowers. So you can see in the example on the screen, the quilter used purple fabric to piece together what looks like a flower on a blue ground. Pieced quilts differ from applique quilts because the piecing, though it can produce a design, is structural rather than decorative. The pieces sewn together actually create the fabric for the quilt top. Whether a wholecloth, applique, or pieced quilt, these fabric artworks deserve to be included in art museum collections and exhibited alongside paintings, sculptures, and other traditional and contemporary art forms. The Columbus Museum of Art will soon open an exhibit debuting floral figure quilts from the Donna and Rodney Wasserstrom collection. This exhibit will hint at the rich array of quilt designs and the skills and artistic vision needed to produce them that are contained in the collection as a whole, which I just learned contains 397 quilts. I am delighted to be here today to build upon the exhibition and highlight some of the phenomenal floral pattern quilts from the Ohio History Connections permanent collections. And I will talk about this quilt later on. Some of the oldest quilts in our collection consist of floral patterns. This wholecloth quilt was made in Connecticut between 1750 and 1800 and was later brought to Marietta, Ohio by the Sayer family when they immigrated there. It consists of 5 pieces of cotton fabric sewn together. You can see 2 seams running vertically up the length of the quilt in the photo, and then there's 2 additional pieces tacked on at the top of the quilt. The natural color fabric features an all-over blue floral pattern with large melon-type fruit and flowers growing from leafy vines in an upward direction. The quilt top and backing are not quilted with sewn stitches. Instead, the quilter used yarn to literally tie the 2 layers together every few inches. This method works well on both pieced and wholecloth quilts and on quilts with no batting, like this one, that are very difficult to quilt. The applied cotton binding finishes the edges of the thin quilt. The beautiful melon and flower pattern on the quilt top fabric was made using what's called a resist dye process. For this fabric, a professional drew the pattern on the cloth and filled the ground with a dye-resistant substance such as paste or wax. After submerging the cloth in blue dye, the resist substance was removed and the pattern was revealed as blue on the natural ground. Resist-dyed fabrics were typically 2 colors, though the process could be repeated several times to add further areas of color. The blue and natural color combination was common in resist dye fabric from this period. The quilter likely purchased this fabric from a local weaver who made and dyed the fabric himself. I can say that a man likely made this fabric because the pattern required skills and training to create, and rarely could women receive such training. Both the construction and the design of this quilt are fairly simple. To make the quilt top, the quilter stitched together the 5 pieces of fabric in straight lines. The tie method she employed to hold the quilt top and backing together required no sewing and could have been completed by a novice. Further, the quilter added no original design elements, relying solely on the fabric's printed pattern for ornamentation. Though it's impossible to know exactly what motivated the quilter to make this particular piece, its simple construction and design enabled her to make a useful household object in the least amount of time possible. At this time, women often worked all day, on the farm, raising the children, cooking meals, caring for the home, etc., and they lacked any leisure time. Wholecloth tied quilts like this one could be made quickly and easily to keep her family warm. The quilter didn't or couldn't waste time creating artistic designs with multiple fabrics and tiny quilting stitches for an item that, as you can tell from the holes and patches visible in the photograph, was meant to be used and would eventually wear out. The quilter could have chosen to use less expensive solid color fabric in her quilt top, but instead chose the melanin flower printed cotton fabric to give her quilt some decorative qualities. Quilters later used popular printed fabrics in their wholecloth quilts to produce stylish household items in short amounts of time. This wholecloth quilt was made between 1800 and 1830, and it has a top that consists of a single piece of cotton chintz fabric. The printed pillar design is on a tan ground with orange, pink, and blue flowers. The quilter, who stitched her initials MEP on the bottom edge of the plain white backing, quilted interlocking circles on her creation that you can't really see in the photograph. This quilt shows that American quilters were not limited to locally made fabrics for their quilts. Women of means could purchase fine cotton fabric imported from other nations. The cotton chintz fabric in this quilt is a glazed calico imported from India, though English and American mills later appropriated these designs and produced domestic chintz fabrics. Chintz typically features flowers on a light background, small overall floral designs for clothing, and larger floral designs like this one for quilts, upholstery, and other household textiles. Products and designs from India flooded the English and then the American markets in the 1700s and 1800s. Great Britain colonized India, and it and the Far East, or the Orient as it was called at the time, captured the imaginations of Americans. They eagerly purchased ceramics, textiles, and other decorative arts adorned with traditional Indian designs. Unlike the resist dye process, chintz floral designs were block printed by hand. Skilled artisans carved wooden blocks with the design in relief, meaning they scraped away the background so the design raised up from the surface. Each block printed one color in the design, so a fabric like this one would have required at least 6 different blocks in order to make it. By the end of the 1700s, chintz designs could be printed with copper rollers. Although they still printed only one color at a time, copper rollers mechanized the printing process and significantly decreased the time required to manufacture chintz and other printed fabrics. A popular quilted chintz item prized by Americans was the palampour. Palampours are a type of chintz fabric panel with a central flower and fruit-bearing serpentine tree, often called a tree of life. The tree is usually pictured growing from a hillock with stylized peaks or rocks. They were a regular feature of the 18th century chintz trade to Europe, where they were prized as wall hangings and bed and table coverings. This Tree of Life wholecloth quilt in the Ohio History Connection collection dates to 1750 to 1800. Palampours like this one are valued for their hand-painted designs. So the outlines of this pattern would have been printed with a roller or with a block, and then a person would have had to hand color in every single color. Nick, could you turn the house lights down a little bit better? Thank you. How's that? Much better. Okay, thank you. The red, blue, and brown flowers, peacocks, and butterflies on this palampour remain vibrant after more than 200 years. This particular palampour has an extra border piece in an identical pattern sewn to the right side, and you can see it in the photo. It appears that the palampour's owner moved the panel's top border to the side to extend the fabric hangings width, possibly to fit a window, door, or wall, or to stretch between 2 bedposts. Regardless, this piece is still an exquisite example of an 18th century palampour. Quilters employed chintz fabrics and other styles of quilt tops as well. The small frame medallion quilt on the left was made around 1800. It features a large central medallion whose design is appliqué from chintz fabric. The wide border and the pieced on-point squares making up the frame around the medallion feature different all-over chintz patterns in shades of brown and cream. Mary Jolliffe Higgins of Higginsport, Ohio, also used chintz fabric for the center square of the Lemoyne Star and Snowball quilt she made between 1800 and 1806. That's the quilt on the right. She constructed her border and outer square appliques from elements of that same chintz fabric that you see in the middle. You'll notice she chose not to extend the yellow chintz border across the top of the quilt. The top edge would have been hidden by pillows when this quilt was used on a bed, so Higgins likely chose not to waste her beautiful imported fabric on a section of the quilt that would not likely be seen. Floral designs on wholecloth quilts were not limited to the use of floral fabric. Several wholecloth quilts in the Ohio History Connections collection feature floral quilted designs on plain white fabric, such as this one made by Martha Morrow Robeson of Warren County, Ohio. This one dates to 1810 to 1815. The quilt has a white cotton top, thin cotton batting, and a coarsely woven white cotton backing. The quilt features stuffed work designs of four-potted flowering vines and grapevines, as well as fringe around the edges. Quilts like this one are called whitework quilts. They consist of all white cotton or linen tops and are quilted with exquisite designs in white thread. The plain white background gives the quilter a canvas on which to create her own artistic design. While other styles of quilts do feature elaborate quilted designs, the whitework quilt's design is enhanced with a stuffed work technique. Stuffed work refers to the raised design on the quilt top. You can see a close-up of Robeson's stuffed work on the right. To create this design, she first outlines the design with small quilting stitches. Then she separates the thread on the loosely woven backing and inserts batting to fill the area between her stitches. For vines, stems, and other straight sections of her design, she inserts cording through small slits in the backing. These holes that she makes usually close up once the quilt is washed, or sometimes she would just rearrange the threads to cover the holes. The large swaths of fabric and yards of thread required to create whitework quilts was prohibitive for many women. Abigail Adams wrote in 1798 that she paid $6 per yard for fabric imported from India. Since that same year, laborers made about $1 per day and agricultural workers even less, the 6 yards of cloth a woman needed to make a whole cloth quilt top could require 36 days of wages, an exorbitant amount for many women, even today. Imported thread was also expensive at the time, and many women used domestically produced cotton, wool, and linen thread very prudently in their household textiles and clothing. Because of the expense of producing a whitework quilt, they were often only made for special occasions. Robeson made this particular whitework quilt as part of her dowry. The beautiful design and small even stitches flaunted her handwork to potential suitors in search of a wife with excellent sewing skills. Very important for a husband at that time. Often women chose to use lengths of purchased fabric to make dresses, shirts, and other clothing for herself and her family, and saved the scraps for household items like quilts. As clothing wore out, she would patch it or pare it down. For instance, her petticoat with a worn bottom hem could be cut and hemmed to become a petticoat for her daughter. And when that wore out, she could cut it into strips and make a pieced quilt. Patterns like the strippy quilt you see here could be made using strips of old fabric. The strippy quilt top on this particular quilt consists of 7 strips of fabric, 4 strips of floral printed lightweight wool, alternating with 3 strips of beige silk. Narrower strips of brown cotton and green paisley lightweight wool make up the border. Though we don't know for sure, the fabric could have been left over from other sewing projects or pieces from worn-out clothing. Assembling this quilt top would have taken significantly longer than a whole cloth quilt top, but the pieced method enabled the quilter to be more economical with her fabric and her budget. As we move into the second quarter of the 19th century, pieced and applique quilts almost entirely displaced whole cloth quilts in popularity in the Ohio History Connections collection. While the pieced quilts incorporate floral fabrics, the applique quilts have, for the first time, original floral designs on their quilt tops. Eliza Jane Secrest made this cotton applique quilt in a starflower pattern in Mount Zion, Ohio, around 1858. Each of the 4 central blocks has 3 large appliqued star flowers, 6 buds, and multiple leaves on a central stem. Secrest appliqued a hummingbird next to each flower, as if they are eating the flower's nectar. A border of vines and oak leaves frames the quilt on all four sides. In each border is an eagle with a ribbon and 9 stars over its head. Now, New Hampshire was the 9th star to enter the Union, so I have no idea what the 9 stars represent, since she was an Ohioan. The applique work was done with fine buttonhole stitching, except for the vines, which were done with a blind stitch. Floral applique quilts in red and green are the most common quilts in the museum collection. Although their designs and layouts vary, they share enough similarities to constitute a distinct style. Each has a red and green color scheme, a center field composed of repeated applique designs on a white background, usually in 4 or 9 identical blocks, a wide outer border with a floral design, and brightly colored binding along the edges. Some Ohio-made quilts also include gold, yellow, or pink accent colors. Other variations include 16-block fields and red and green fabrics that appear solid-colored from a distance, but upon closer inspection are small-scale all-over prints. The rise in popularity of applique quilts at this time was due in part to the declining cost of fabric in the second quarter of the 19th century. Prior to that time, most manufactured fabric sold in the United States was imported from England. As a British colony, Americans had to export raw materials to England for processing to ensure British manufacturing dominance and American colonial dependence. Shipping the raw materials and the finished products back and forth across the Atlantic added to the cost for American consumers. Great Britain also closely guarded its manufacturing processes, so Americans remained dependent on British imports even after they gained independence. It wasn't until 1825 that women had access to fabrics manufactured in the United States. As more mills were established, the price of cotton declined sharply, first to 37.5 cents per yard in 1832, and then to about 12 cents per yard in 1843. This was down, you'll remember, from the $6 per yard that Abigail Adams paid in 1798. The sudden popularity of applique quilts beginning in 1840 signaled a marked shift from the wholecloth and pieced quilts that had dominated Ohio quilt designs for decades. The declining cost of domestically produced cotton fabric partially explains why this quilt style was accessible to more women, but the consistent similarities between red and green applique quilts suggest there were other factors involved. This Dutch Tulips applique quilt offers a clue to the sudden appearance of red and green applique quilts in Ohio. Mrs. Wesley Wright of Trough Creek Valley, Pennsylvania, made this quilt in 1840. The cotton quilt features alternating blocks of red, yellow, and green tulips and red roses on a vine, appliqued to white blocks and pieced together diagonally. This layout is called en point because the squares rest on one corner or on their points. The quilt has an inner border of red and green diamonds and an outer border of appliqued red roses on a green vine. Tulips, a popular flower in Germany, were often featured on German decorative arts, including blanket chests, coverlets, and, of course, quilts. The appearance of red and green floral applique quilts follows the immigration path of some Germans who settled first in Pennsylvania and then moved west to Ohio. Textile historian Ricky Clark surveyed the Ohio History Connection's red and green applique quilts in the book Quilts and Community, Ohio's Traditions. She found that more than half of the quilts for which the maker's ethnic identity was known were made by women of German descent. While some of these quilters incorporated Dutch tulips in the German tradition, others drew inspiration from the myriad of flowers and plants around them to create truly unique designs. Taste and style also impacted the use of floral designs for red and green applique quilts. Floral prints, engravings, and paintings were second only to portraits in popularity in the 17 and 1800s. Floral motifs dominated decorative arts. They adorned china, wallpaper, fabric, carpets, and painted furniture. In addition, red and green were popular colors for home decoration. These bold colors were found in curtains, upholstery, and carpets, as well as quilts. Flowers, with their red petals and green leaves and stems, lent themselves to this color combination. In Ohio, a distinct red and green floral applique design emerged called Ohio Rose. This pattern, seen in the quilt on the left, made between 1840 and 1860, features identical blocks with a large rose encircled by 8 rosebuds appliqued to a white ground. In this particular piece, the quilter filled the space between the rose appliques with 2 concentric circles of stuffed feathered wreath quilting. The quilt on the right, made in Leetonia, Ohio in 1924, is a 20th century interpretation of the Ohio rose applique pattern. Although the red and green applique quilt style reached its peak popularity in the 1850s, quilters revived it following the First World War. The modern quilt features framed blocks of appliqued roses encircled by alternating rosebuds and leaves in shades of bright pink. Pink was a popular color palette in the 1920s, and the quilter employs it in the sashing as well as the appliques, giving the old pattern a modern look. In addition to developing a unique pattern, Ohio quilters also tended to include an accent color in their red and green applique quilts, usually orange, yellow, or pink. This applique quilt was made by Julia Hayden Marshall and her daughter, Frances Marshall McClurg, in Greer, Ohio, around 1860. The 4 applique blocks are set around a central square on point and feature a unique design that combines pineapple, princess feather, and pinwheel motifs in green and red. There are urns centered at the edge of each side with a pineapple on top and flowers and grapevines extending from the urns to form an applique border. Marshall was not a native of Ohio. She was born in upstate New York and lived with her husband in Connecticut before moving to Steubenville and later Greer, Ohio. Yet she and her daughter were influenced by quilt styles in their new home, choosing to adopt the Ohio color palette by adding orange blossoms to the applique border. While quilters could create any applique design they could imagine, they often drew inspiration from other decorative arts. Textile historian Ricky Clark notes that the urn and grapevine border design in Marshall and McClurg's quilt recalls patterns seen on jacquard coverlets that were made in that part of Ohio at about the same time. And in fact, Marshall's husband, Edward, was a professional weaver who made jacquard coverlets, first in Connecticut and later in Ohio. Clark identifies one of Edward's coverlets in the Ohio History Connections collection that has a woven design bearing a striking resemblance to the quilt's border. The coverlet features peacocks on top of footed urns holding an array of flowers with a pineapple nested on a bed of leaves at the mouth of each urn. You can see the design I'm referring to on the right of the slide. While textiles, wallpaper, and ceramics often had grapevine and urn motifs, the combination of urn and pineapple is quite unique. Although we don't know which family member first conceived of the design, the similarities between the quilt and the coverlet exemplify the influence decorative arts pieces exerted on one another. Quilters likely stitched red and green applique quilts for special occasions rather than for everyday use. Few quilters left a record detailing the motivations for their quilts, but comparing the quilts that remain today reveals a discernible pattern. Many of the red and green applique quilts in the Ohio History Connections collection, including the Marshall and McClurg quilt, are in excellent condition and appear unused. This suggests quilters made applique quilts for special occasions and not for use as household textiles. Another indicator of these quilts' status as special occasion items includes the matching red and green fabrics used on each one. As I discussed earlier, many quilters used large swaths of purchased fabric to make new clothes and made quilts from the remnants. It would have been difficult for a quilter to have enough scraps to create an applique quilt from matching fabric, so she likely had to purchase the cloth instead. The written histories that accompany some quilts support this conclusion. Approximately 1/3 of pre-Civil War applique quilts were made for dowries, weddings, or other occasions. That's also one of the reasons why so many of them survive today. This Rose of Sharon quilt helps to enumerate the reasons why red and green applique quilts were mainly decorative gifts rather than utilitarian items. This all-cotton quilt has 9 red and green applique blocks in a straight set with sashing. The applique pattern, called either the Rose of Sharon or the Wig Rose, has 4 branches with leaves and rosebuds radiating out from a central rose. The maker, Mrs. John Acton Robey, likely purchased the fabric she used in this quilt. Though the price of cotton cloth had fallen significantly since the turn of the 19th century, it was still an expense that many households couldn't spare on a regular basis. Piece designs were a much more economical method for using fabric scraps and textile remnants to create quilt top fabrics. Appliqué designs, on the other hand, used matching colored fabrics and required large pieces of fabric on which to apply the colored design. In this quilt in particular, each rosebud of red and green fabric is reverse appliqued and detailed with green chain embroidery. Reverse applique is a method for creating a design by placing the colored fabric underneath the white fabric and then cutting away the white fabric of the quilt top to reveal the color and the design below. It's much more time-consuming and very difficult to do, and also very beautiful because it gives a really interesting three-dimensional quality to the quilt top. Robey clearly spent extra time creating her Rose of Sharon design in this manner, suggesting that she was either showcasing her needlework skills or creating the quilt as a special gift. A hand-sewn label stitched to the quilt states that the quilt was entered in a competition at some point, which is a fitting tribute to Robey's skill and her beautiful quilt. After the Civil War, floral designs on quilts changed drastically. 24-year-old Anna Simpson of Ross County, Ohio, stitched this quilt in 1887. This crazy quilt, named for its patternless design, consists of 5 rows of 5 randomly pieced blocks of silk and cotton with a solid block in the center. Americans' exposure to Japanese design at the 1876 Centennial International Exhibition in Philadelphia motivated the patternless, asymmetrical, crazy quilt design. The velvet maroon outer border features embroidered initials, A, I, and S, for Anna Isabel Simpson. There's a floral design wrapped around each letter and a bouquet of pink roses. You can see the bouquet in detail on the right of the slide. The silk, velvet, and cotton fabrics that comprise Simpson's quilt would not have held up with heavy use, so this quilt was likely intended as a showpiece, as were most crazy quilts. The embroidered stitches along each pieced edge, the gold-corded binding, and the myriad of embroidered designs attest to Simpson's needlework skills. Crazy quilts, for the first time, afforded their makers absolute control over every element of the design, from the layout to the colors to the embellishments, which on this quilt include embroidered and painted flowers. Pink roses adorn the border, water lilies fill the center block, and sunflowers, daisies, and other flowers decorate many of the fabric pieces. Simpson also embroidered leaves on several blocks, adding further to the natural elements in her design. American quilters often incorporated floral and natural elements in their quilt tops during the Victorian era in the United States. In this period, from roughly the Civil War to the turn of the 20th century, Americans filled their homes with decorative elements inspired by nature, including dried botanical arrangements displayed under glass domes, seashell creations, and cases filled with taxidermy birds of every description. At a time when the United States was undergoing industrializations, the Victorians embraced natural history and included it in their home decor as a counterbalance to their increasingly mechanized world. The numerous flowers and leaves Simpson included in her quilt top exemplify this Victorian design. In the 20th century, quilters created floral quilts by interpreting old patterns in new ways. The pieced cotton quilt on the left, called Grandmother's Flower Garden or Grandmother's Flower Basket, features 56 hexagonal blocks, each comprised of a central yellow hexagon framed by 2 layers of matching hexagons. White hexagonal blocks serve as sashing to separate the colored blocks, creating the illusion of flowers on a white ground. Sarah Elizabeth Rausch of Union County, Ohio, made this quilt between 1925 and 1945, but the design is much older than the quilt. Quilts made in the hexagon pattern initially looked like the quilt top on the right, which was made between 1835 and 1855, nearly 100 years before Rausch's quilt. The quilt top consists of hexagonal blocks constructed of smaller hexagonal pieces that form 5 concentric rings, alternating between white and printed color flat fabrics. Hexagons made of brick red printed fabric serve as sashing to separate the blocks. Hexagon quilts were popular in the United States beginning in the early 1800s and in Great Britain before then. The pattern's use spread in 1850 after Godey's Ladies' Book, a popular women's magazine, published several variations of it. However, it wasn't until the 20th century that quilters adapted the pattern to create a discernible floral design and renamed it to capture its new interpretation. Red and green applique quilts also made a comeback in 1920s America. Mary Mogan of Orient, Ohio made this pomegranate applique quilt between 1929 and 1936. She based the quilt on the Ladies' Art Company pattern number 6018, titled Rose and Peony, published in the magazine Farm and Fireside in September 1929. The white quilt has pink roses with yellow centers, from which extend 4 leafy stems, ending in red, yellow, and green pomegranates. The floral applique is arranged to create 4 vertical and 5 horizontal lines. The center of each square created by the floral applique has a circle of feathered quilting. The single border features a green vine with pink roses, and the scalloped edges are bound with bright red cotton fabric. The quilt is a variation of 19th century red and green applique quilts. It has most of the same design elements. One notable difference between Mogan's quilt pattern and older versions is its use of applique pieces to create frames that seem to emphasize the quilted blocks, rather than using the appliques as the main design elements of the blocks themselves. I've mentioned several quilt patterns that reemerged in the years following World War I. In response to the death and carnage inflicted by modern weapons during the war, which waged in Europe from 1914 to 1918, Americans longed for a quote-unquote simpler past before industrialized warfare maimed and killed so many young men. Older styles of art, architecture, and even quilt patterns regained popularity as nostalgic Americans tried to erase the memory of the war. Although this style period is often called colonial revival, many of the art and quilt styles being revived actually dated to the post-Civil War era, and like Mogan's quilt, they often had modern twists. The return to normalcy after the war included urging women to leave their wartime positions in factories and the military and resume their duties as wives and mothers. As part of both the return to normalcy and the colonial revival movement, women took up quilting and other handwork, which had fallen out of favor in the decades before the war. National companies like Sears and Roebuck and Montgomery Ward sponsored quilt competitions to generate excitement about domestic arts. Mogan's quilt won first prize in the modern quilt category and best appliqué quilt at the Montgomery Ward contest in Washington Courthouse, Ohio in 1936. The judges cited the quilt's design, quilting, colors, and workmanship as the reasons for selecting it as the top entry. Mogan received $15, a paper ribbon, and a paper plaque. We have the ribbon as well as the judges' comments in our collection, and I find it really interesting that they criticized her overuse of applique in the corners of her border. They said it was unnecessary. Newspapers as well as magazines published floral patterns to aid novice quilters in the 1920s and 30s. 19th century quilters created unique floral designs inspired by popular decor, other decorative arts, and even other quilters in their region. But in the decades after World War I, women like Mary Mogan could create beautiful quilts by following published patterns, whether or not they were skilled at handwork. Quilt patterns became increasingly important in the 1930s and 40s. The Great Depression and World War II rationing forced many women to piece quilts from scraps and remnants to stretch their meager means to make do or do without, as the popular saying went. The Kansas City Star, a newspaper in Missouri, published the quilt pattern used to make the quilt you see here in the 1930s. Doris Edith Allen, a native of Cincinnati, Ohio, stitched this Missouri Daisy or Kansas Star pattern quilt while living in Cleveland in about 1945, so about 10 years after it was first published. The cotton pieced and applique quilt has 18 blocks separated by butterscotch sashing. Each block features hand applique daisies in yellow calicos and prints with solid yellow and butterscotch fabrics in raised puff between each petal. The quilt's bright shades of yellow stand in stark contrast to the darker fabrics that dominated textiles during the Great Depression and World War II. The pattern, however, is not a new design. The newspaper published a 20th century variation of the 8-point star pattern traditionally called Lemoyne Star. Although most women quilted with sewing machines at this time, Allen chose to quilt this piece by hand. This was perhaps as a testament to her skills as a home economics educator, or perhaps to differentiate her quilt from others made with the same popular pattern. Her cheery daisy pattern in bright yellows conveys an optimism that characterized American society in the years following the Second World War. While many published patterns in the 20th century adapted older designs, like the Missouri daisy, others were new original designs created by artists, designers, and quilters. Doris Edith Allen also made this quilt, a cotton applique kit quilt in the French baskets with scroll blocks pattern. The quilt has a total of 30 side-by-side blocks that alternate between applique floral baskets and applique white emblems. Marie Webster designed this pattern. Webster helped lead the 20th century quilt revival as a designer for the popular magazine, The Ladies' Home Journal. She also authored one of the first books on quilt history, published in 1915, titled Quilts, Their Story and How to Make Them. In addition to designing patterns for sale and publication in periodicals, Webster also sold her patterns as kits. Allen likely purchased her quilt kit from a mail order catalog or a local department store, and it would have contained pre-cut fabric, thread, and instructions for assembling this beautiful floral pattern quilt. While some textile scholars have lamented that patterns and kits led to the homogenization of quilt patterns in the United States, they do acknowledge that these tools enabled more 20th century women to make quilts. For instance, Martha Galloway Petrucci of Columbus, Ohio, made this baby quilt in 1958 from a kit she purchased at F&R Lazarus and Company in downtown Columbus. 4 of the 20 squares on this white cotton quilt feature an embroidered scene of a house, a church, a couple, and a baby cradle. The remainder have floral designs containing roses, tulips, and hearts. All of the designs are embroidered in hot pink thread. The designs wish love, marriage, faith, home, and family for the child for whom Martha made this quilt. The blocks came pre-stamped with the designs for Petrucci to embroider, which made creating this quilt much easier and less time-consuming than using pieced or appliqué patterns. And I should point out that she made this quilt before she had the baby, and she had a boy. So she never actually ended up using this quilt for him. Making quilts was a necessity for many women during the Great Depression and the Second World War, but it fell out of favor afterwards. Most families could afford to purchase textiles during the economic boom that followed the war, and women abandoned quilt making, which had become associated with the scarcity of the Great Depression and the rationing of the war years. As a result, many women in the mid-20th century lacked the time or the skills, or both, to make quilts, and kits like this one enabled floral pattern quilts to survive as a domestic art, though in a modified form. Not all women gave up creating original floral designs on quilts during this period. Thelma Leota Edwards Kearns of Hocking County, Ohio, designed and stitched this State Flowers quilt between 1930 and 1940. I should point out that Kearns was born in 1922, so she made this quilt as a young girl. Each white cotton block features an embroidered state abbreviation, an image of that state's flower, and the name of the flower set in pink sashing. You'll note Ohio's red carnation block, which I have a detailed photo of on the right. Kearns pieced and embroidered the quilt top by hand, and her mother, Sarah Elizabeth Elick Edwards, hand quilted the piece. The crude floral designs and uneven lettering suggest that Kearns was still a novice at drawing and embroidery when she made this quilt. We have a later quilt top embroidered by Kearns in our collection, whose design is more complex and refined, which suggests that Kearns honed her needlework skills through projects like the State Flowers quilt. From the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s, floral designs in quilts and other decorative arts experienced renewed popularity. This kit applique quilt, made between 1970 and 1973 by Carrie Lawrence Swain of Springfield, Ohio, features Sunbonnet Sue raking her flower garden. Sunbonnet Sue had been a popular motif for applique children's quilts since about 1920, but these quilts usually depict Sunbonnet Sue in profile, appliqued to white blocks connected by colorful sashing. This quilt, however, adds a rake and a flower garden to the traditional design. The pattern was likely inspired by the popular Back to Nature or Back to the Earth movement that started in the mid-1960s. This movement, driven by a young subgroup of hippie culture, encouraged people to build a simpler, better society in rural areas away from what it deemed sick mainstream society. Perhaps some of you remember these so-called flower children. They set up communes in rural areas, wore cloth woven from natural fibers, and decorated themselves with chains of flowers. Swain further emphasized the nature theme in her quilt by making many of the sunbonnet Sioux dresses from floral print cottons. Textiles, upholstery, and other home decor fabrics incorporated floral motifs during the approximately 10 years the Back to Nature movement was in vogue. The more recent quilts in the Ohio History Connection collection are works of art rather than utilitarian objects. Among these quilts are several floral pattern quilts made by Bucyrus, Ohio resident Lois Ide. This quilt, titled The Monkey and the Leopard, and completed in 1987, is based on a jacquard coverlet by the same name, believed to have been woven in Ohio between 1830 and 1849. It features large 8-pointed stars whose rays radiate out from center appliques of blue and red tulips. The ground between the stars is filled with blue vines from which extend blue leaves, red and blue flowers, red butterflies, and bluebirds. Appliques of red grapes with blue leaves decorate the right and left borders. A series of applique vignettes in shades of blue showing a monkey facing a leopard make up the top and bottom double borders and are the source of the quilt's name. Ide added artistic flourishes to this quilt that justify its classification as a work of art. To authentically recreate the coverlet design, she used antique red and indigo cottons for the applique that she then embellished with extensive hand embroidery. The quilt has a three-dimensional quality to it because she worked the butterflies and flowers with ruching. Ruching is a labor-intensive, time-consuming sewing technique in which fabric or ribbon is gathered in a repeating pattern to form ruffles, scallops, petals, or in this case, butterfly wings. Her design earned her quilt a place in the 1991 volume of Great American Quilts, where she is recognized as an outstanding quilt artist. Ide also created original floral pattern quilts. She completed this one, aptly named A Vase of Flowers, in 1988. The framed medallion quilt features a light orange vase filled with yellow gladioli, red tulips, yellow tiger lilies, and burgundy bellflowers, appliqued to a blue ground. The black frame and red inner border literally frame the floral image, creating the illusion that the textile is actually a still life painting. Like the texture of paint on a canvas, Ide gave depth to this modern version of a still life painting by stuffing the appliqued flowers and adding a stuffed design to the vase. You can see a close-up of some of the stuffed flowers to the right. Her beautiful quilts are not merely bed coverings, they are works of art. Skilled quilters and designers like Ide earned a place for themselves and their floral pattern quilts in the art genre. Ide, a master quilter, gained fame as a fabric artist through her published works and writings. Her quilts have been shown in several museums, including the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and her expertise has been sought out by other artists in her popular lectures and workshops. Today, quilters have a variety of sources from which to pull inspiration for their quilt patterns. Companies still publish paper patterns created by designers and sold in stores and featured in quilt magazines. Individuals share their patterns online on sites like Pinterest and in public blogs. Quilt guilds of every sort encourage their members to create new designs as part of their regular meetings, and themed shows inspire many new patterns. With all of these sources, I'm certain we'll continue to see new versions of floral pattern quilts for many years to come. Thank you.